Your mother won't need that house much longer. Vanessa wrote in the group chat. Once we convince her she can't manage alone, it's ours. Helen Carter stood frozen in her own kitchen. One hand still wrapped around the dish towel she had been using to dry the good china. Her eyes locked on the glowing screen of her son's phone where the words stared back at her in cold black letters. Daniel had left it on the marble counter beside the fruit bowl, carelessly face up and unlocked, while he stepped outside to take a call. She had not meant to look. 68. Helen still believed in privacy, in manners, in not snooping through other people's things. But when the notification flashed across the screen and she saw the words Operation Newhouse, something inside her tightened. Her fingers moved before her conscience could stop them. Now she stood there reading message after message from the people she loved most, and with every line her chest felt colder. Melissa had replied with a laughing emoji. Mom still thinks we visit because we care. Daniel answered. Just keep pushing the idea that the stairs are dangerous. She's already nervous after slipping in the garden. Then Vanessa again. Once she agrees to assisted living, we can list the place by spring. The market will be perfect. Helen's throat closed so tightly she could barely breathe. For a moment she thought perhaps she was misunderstanding, that there had to be some context she was missing, some cruel joke written in poor taste. But there it was in plain English. Message after message discussing her home, her future, her life, as if she were already gone. The house around her suddenly felt different. The same warm kitchen where she had baked birthday cakes for 40 years, where her late husband Thomas had stood every Sunday morning making pancakes in his bathrobe, where her grandchildren had once sat at the island with sticky fingers and bright smiles, now felt like a stage set for a lie she had been too trusting to see. Outside the window, the backyard glowed gold in the late afternoon sun. The maple tree Thomas planted the year Daniel turned 10 swaying gently in the breeze. Helen remembered standing beneath that tree with her husband 23 years ago, promising each other they would grow old in this house, that no matter what changed, this place would always be home. Thomas had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a sudden heart attack on a rainy Tuesday morning that split Helen's life cleanly in half. Before and after. Since then, she had done her best to keep moving, to keep the house polished, the roses trimmed, the traditions alive. She hosted Sunday dinners because family mattered, because Thomas would have wanted the house full of laughter, because she believed love meant showing up again and again even after grief hollowed you out. Yet now she saw the truth in tiny memories that came rushing back with sickening clarity. Vanessa asking how much the property taxes were these days. Melissa casually mentioning how exhausting it must be for Helen to keep up such a large house. Daniel insisting she should consider something smaller every few months with that rehearsed tone of concern. It had never been concern. It had been strategy. The back door opened and Daniel's footsteps sounded on the patio. Helen set the phone exactly where it had been and picked up the dish towel again, her hand steady despite the earthquake inside her chest. When her son walked in smiling, reaching for his phone with a cheerful, "Thanks again for dinner, Mom," Helen looked at him and felt something in her change forever. She smiled back, soft and calm, the way women like her learn to smile through funerals and betrayals and disappointments too deep for tears. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. "Anything for family." And as Daniel kissed her cheek and turned away, Helen Carter made a silent promise to herself. She would not cry. She would not confront them. She would not give them the satisfaction of knowing she had seen the truth. She would smile, and listen, and wait, because if her children wanted to treat her like she was already gone, then they were about to learn exactly what kind of woman they had underestimated. That night Helen did not sleep. She lay in the king-sized bed she had once shared with Thomas, staring at the ceiling while moonlight stretched across the room in pale silver bands, and every memory she had trusted for the past 2 years began rearranging itself into something uglier. Grief had made her vulnerable. She saw that now. After Thomas died, the silence in the house had become a living thing, settling into corners and hallways, following her from room to room like a shadow. She had learned to fill it with routine. Every morning she rose at 6:30, brewed coffee in the same chipped blue mug Thomas had bought her in Maine 20 years earlier, and sat at the kitchen table overlooking the backyard while the sun climbed over the fence. She watered the roses herself, trimmed the hedges herself, paid every bill herself. She had forced herself to master the furnace settings Thomas used to handle, and the online banking he once insisted was too confusing for her. She had survived widowhood one ordinary task at a time. Yet somewhere along the way, Daniel and the others had begun treating her competence as temporary, as if grief and age had turned her into someone fragile. Looking back, Helen could now see how carefully it had started. Vanessa showing up with grocery bags Helen had not asked for and saying, "You should not be lifting heavy things anymore." Melissa replacing Helen's step stool with a smaller one and laughing, "We do not want you taking a tumble." Daniel insisting on mowing the lawn every other week, then sighing dramatically about how hard it must be for you to manage all this. At the time, Helen had mistaken it for concern. She had thanked them. She had even bragged to her church friends that her children were attentive. The humiliation of that realization burned hotter than anger. Around 3 in the morning she rose from bed and padded barefoot down the hallway, her hand trailing across the wallpaper Thomas had hung himself 31 years ago. She stopped in front of the study and pushed open the door. The room still smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Thomas's desk remained exactly as he had left it, polished oak with the brass lamp on the corner and framed photographs of their family lined neatly across the surface. Helen sank into his chair and looked around at the room where her husband had managed their finances, written birthday cards, and spent late nights balancing budgets so their children would never want for anything. They had built this life together from nothing. Thomas had worked double shifts his first 10 years as an electrician while Helen took bookkeeping jobs from home, so she could raise the children. They skipped vacations, drove used cars, patched the roof themselves more than once. Every floorboard in this house had been paid for with sacrifice. Every room had a memory stitched into it. Daniel's pencil marks still lined the pantry doorway from the years Helen measured his height. Melissa's old ballet trophies remained boxed in the attic. The stain on the dining room floor from the Christmas their golden retriever knocked over the gravy boat still sat beneath the rug. And those same children now sat in a group chat discussing how to remove her from it like an obstacle in their way. Helen opened the bottom drawer of Thomas's desk and withdrew the black leather folder where he had kept their important papers. Insurance policies, property records, estate documents. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she flipped through the neatly labeled tabs. If her family thought she was helpless, they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed grief had made her foolish. But grief had not made Helen Carter foolish. It had made her quieter, sharper, more aware of how quickly life could change. She closed the folder and stared out the study window into the dark backyard, where the porch light cast long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. The house creaked softly around her, familiar and steady, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Helen rested one hand on the leather folder and allowed herself one final moment of heartbreak for the family she thought she had. Then she straightened her spine, wiped the tears she had not realized were there, and reached for the phone beside the desk. At 8 o'clock the next morning, she intended to call the only man she trusted to help her protect what was hers. At precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, Helen sat in the parking lot outside the law office of Martin Green with both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, her heartbeat steady in a way that surprised even her. The brick building stood exactly as it had for decades, with polished brass letters beside the door and flower boxes beneath the front windows that Martin's wife changed every season. Thomas had trusted Martin with every important document their family ever signed, and after 35 years of friendship, Helen trusted him too. When Martin ushered her into his office and asked gently what had brought her in so early, Helen did not waste time pretending this was a social visit. She told him everything. The phone, the messages, the plan. She watched his expression shift from polite concern to quiet outrage as she slid the photographs of the group chat across his desk. He read each screenshot slowly, jaw tightening. "Helen," he said at last, setting the phone down with deliberate care. They were discussing legal and competency evaluations. She nodded once. "I know. They intended to build a case that you can no longer manage your own affairs." The words sounded clinical in Martin's voice, but hearing them spoken aloud made the betrayal more real than ever. Helen folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Can they do it?" Martin leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Not if we move first. And not if you are exactly the woman I know you are." For the first time since reading the messages, Helen felt something close to relief. Martin spent the next hour walking her through every protection available. Her estate was already solid, but there were steps they could take immediately to make any future attempt against her far more difficult. Updated directives, independent medical competency evaluations from physicians of her choosing, formal revisions to her trust, detailed records of all communications moving forward. Helen listened carefully, asking precise questions in the same calm tone she once used balancing the household books when money was tight and every dollar mattered. Martin finally gave her a long look and said, "You are handling this better than most people would." Helen's smile held no warmth. "Crying will not save my house." By noon the first round of paperwork was complete. By afternoon, Helen sat in her family doctor's office for a full wellness evaluation, chatting pleasantly while the physician noted that her memory, judgment, mobility, and cognition were all excellent for her age. She drove home with official documentation in her purse and a cold clarity in her chest. Her family thought they were planning for a week-old woman. They were planning for someone who no longer existed. That evening Daniel called, his voice warm and easy. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. You doing okay after yesterday?" Helen stood at the sink rinsing coffee cups, her tone light. "Perfectly fine. Sweetheart, you sure? Vanessa and I were talking and thinking maybe it is time we start discussing some options for the house long term. Just planning ahead." There it was, barely 24 hours after she discovered the chat, and already he was beginning to test the waters. Helen dried the cup slowly with a dish towel. "That is thoughtful of you," she said. "Perhaps we can all sit down and discuss it soon." Daniel sounded pleased, as though he believed the first wall had already cracked. "Great idea, Mom. We just want what is best for you." Helen stared through the kitchen window at the backyard where Thomas once taught Daniel to throw a baseball, where Melissa learned to ride her bicycle while Helen ran behind her laughing. And for one sharp moment she nearly hated herself for remembering those children while speaking to the adults they had become. "I know," she said softly. "That is what family does. After all." She hung up and placed the phone down carefully. Then she walked to the study, opened Martin's folder, and added the doctor's evaluation to the growing stack of documents inside. If her children wanted to build a case against her, Helen intended to let them try. Every lie they told from this point forward would only strengthen hers. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday, and from the moment Daniel arrived with Vanessa carrying a store-bought pie and exaggerated smiles, Helen understood they believed the game was nearly over. Melissa came 10 minutes later with her husband, Greg, wearing the same expression people brought to hospital waiting rooms and funerals, that rehearsed blend of concern and pity meant to imply tragedy before a word had even been spoken. Helen welcomed them all with perfect politeness, poured coffee into her best cups, and served slices of pie on the good china she had once reserved for holidays. If they intended to perform concern, she would provide the stage. They sat around the dining room table where countless birthdays and Christmas dinners had once unfolded, but now every smile felt like costume jewelry, bright and false. Daniel cleared his throat first. "Mom, We wanted to talk because we love you. Helen folded her hands in her lap and nodded as if touched. That is kind of you. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice coated in practiced sweetness. We have all noticed you seem more tired lately. Forgetful, too. Helen nearly admired the audacity. Forgetful? Melissa gave a small sympathetic sigh. You forgot Emma's recital last month, Mom. Helen had missed the recital because Melissa told her the wrong time. A detail she now understood had not been accidental. Greg chimed in next. And Daniel said you got confused with your banking app recently. Helen looked at her son. He did not meet her eyes. It happens. Mom, we're just worried. This house is a lot for one person. There it was again. Always the house. Never subtle enough to hide the obsession for long. Helen let her expression soften into something wounded but thoughtful, as if their words were sinking in. I suppose I have had a lot on my mind since your father passed. Vanessa reached across the table and patted Helen's hand with the confidence of a woman who believed victory was close. Exactly. And there is no shame in needing help. We found a beautiful senior living community just 20 minutes away. Chef-prepared meals, housekeeping, transportation. You would love it. Daniel slid a glossy brochure across the table. Helen glanced at it briefly before setting it aside. You have certainly done your research. Melissa gave a relieved smile, mistaking Helen's calm for surrender. We just want you somewhere safe. Helen lowered her eyes and allowed a careful pause to stretch across the room. Then she asked softly, and what would happen to the house? Too quickly. Daniel answered, well, obviously we would help manage the sale. It would make the most sense for one of us to oversee everything. Greg added, the market is excellent right now. You could get top dollar. Vanessa could not help herself. Honestly, the property alone is worth a fortune. The room fell still after that. No one missed what she had just revealed. Helen watched embarrassment flicker across Daniel's face, but only for a second. Then he pressed on. Mom, we think it is time to start making responsible decisions before something happens. Helen looked at each of them in turn, letting the silence grow heavy enough to make them uncomfortable. These were her children. Her family, people she had fed, clothed, comforted, celebrated, and yet none of them looked ashamed. Not truly, only impatient. She drew a slow breath and nodded. You may be right, she said at last. The relief that washed over their faces was immediate and ugly. Vanessa nearly smiled too broadly. Daniel reached for Helen's hand. You are doing the smart thing, Mom. Helen gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Then let us do this properly. She looked around the table with serene composure. Set up a meeting with everyone involved, lawyers included. If I am making a life-changing decision, I want every detail in writing. Daniel and Melissa exchanged a triumphant glance they tried and failed to hide. They believed she had folded. They believed the hardest part was over. Helen rose to refill the coffee pot, her movements graceful and unhurried. And as she turned away from them, she allowed herself the smallest private smile. Let them think they had one. People were always most careless when they believed victory was certain. The formal meeting was set for Thursday afternoon at Martin Green's office, and in the days leading up to it, Helen watched her family transform before her eyes. They called more often than they had in months. Daniel stopped by twice with groceries she had not requested. Melissa sent links to retirement communities with cheerful little notes about gardening clubs and wine nights, as though packaging betrayal in pleasant language made it kindness. Vanessa even arrived one morning with a basket of muffins and the false tenderness of a woman rehearsing for an audience. We just want this transition to be easy for you, she said while standing in Helen's kitchen, looking around the room with barely concealed hunger, her gaze lingering on the marble countertops and crown molding as if mentally redecorating. Helen smiled and thanked her. She offered coffee. She played the role of the slightly overwhelmed widow so convincingly that by Wednesday evening Daniel called and said, "I am proud of you for handling this so maturely, Mom." Helen nearly laughed after hanging up. On Thursday she dressed with the care of someone attending church on Easter Sunday. Navy dress, pearl earrings, low heels. She styled her silver hair neatly and applied the same rose lipstick she had worn for decades. If her family intended to dismantle her life, she would not meet them looking defeated. When she arrived at Martin's office, the receptionist greeted her warmly and escorted her into the large conference room where Martin had already arranged everything. A long polished table gleamed beneath soft overhead lights. Legal folders sat neatly stacked at one end. Helen took her seat beside Martin and folded her hands calmly atop the leather folder in front of her. 10 minutes later the others arrived together, smiling in that brittle, overconfident way people smiled when they believed the outcome had already been decided. Daniel looked almost excited. Vanessa wore cream-colored slacks and the expression of a woman attending a closing. Melissa carried a notepad she clearly did not need. Greg gave Helen an encouraging nod, the sort one might offer a nervous patient before surgery. They took their seats opposite her. Martin began pleasantly. "Thank you all for coming. My understanding is that we are here to discuss Mrs. Carter's future living arrangements and estate planning." Daniel jumped in first. "Yes. We are all concerned that Mom can no longer safely maintain the house on her own. We think moving her into assisted living is the responsible next step." Melissa nodded solemnly. "It is what is best for her." Vanessa added, "We all just want to make sure she is protected." Martin listened without interruption, then folded his hands. "I see. Before we proceed, I should note that Mrs. Carter requested a full independent medical and cognitive evaluation this week." The smiles across the table faltered. Martin slid copies of the physician's report toward them one by one. "As documented here, Mrs. Carter is in excellent physical and mental health, fully capable of managing her own affairs, and demonstrates no signs of cognitive decline." Silence fell so fast it felt physical. Daniel blinked. Melissa stared at the papers. Vanessa's face lost color. Martin continued evenly. "Additionally, Mrs. Carter has asked that I present evidence relevant to the motivations behind this meeting." Helen opened her folder at last and slid printed screenshots across the polished table. The group chat. Every message. Every cruel joke. Every discussion of manipulating her into leaving her home. Every line of greed and calculation laid bare in black and white. No one spoke. No one moved. Daniel looked as if the air had been punched from his lungs. Melissa whispered, "Mom." But Helen raised one hand and the room fell silent again. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm enough to freeze water. "You all seem very concerned about my future, so I made a few decisions of my own." Martin placed one final document in front of them. "Mrs. Carter has amended her trust. Effective immediately. None of the individuals present other than Mrs. Carter remain beneficiaries to the property." Vanessa's mouth fell open. Daniel surged forward in his chair. "What?" Helen met his eyes with a serenity that made his outrage look childish. "You wanted my house so badly," she said softly. "Now none of you will ever have it." The silence shattered all at once. Daniel shot to his feet so quickly his chair scraped hard against the floor. His face drained of color and twisted with disbelief. "Mom, this is insane," he snapped, the warmth stripped entirely from his voice. "You cannot be serious." Melissa stared at the printed screenshots like they might somehow rearrange themselves into innocence if she blinked enough. Greg muttered something under his breath and leaned back in his chair, suddenly unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. But Vanessa was the first to recover. She straightened her shoulders and forced out a brittle laugh. This is absurd. Those messages were jokes. Helen turned her gaze toward her slowly. Jokes? Vanessa's confidence faltered. Private jokes. We were venting. You took everything out of context. Martin folded his hands and said calmly, discussing legal incompetency strategies and forced relocation is not generally considered humor in probate court. Daniel rounded on Helen then, his voice rising. You went through my phone? The outrage in his tone was almost enough to make the moment laughable. Helen held his stare without flinching. That is your concern? Not what I found, only that I found it. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then tried a different tactic. Softer now. Wounded. Mom, we were worried about you. We were trying to help. Helen's expression did not change. Help yourselves. Melissa's eyes filled with tears, though whether from shame or panic Helen could not tell. We made a mistake. She whispered. Please do not do this. We are family. The word landed hollow. Helen looked at her daughter and thought of every school recital, every fevered night, every sacrifice made without hesitation because that was what mothers did. Then she thought of the laughing emoji beside the message mocking her loneliness. Family does not plot behind locked screens to strip each other of dignity. She said quietly. Family does not circle like vultures while someone is still alive. Daniel slammed both palms onto the table. You are overreacting. Martin's voice cut in sharp and cold. Mr. Carter, you will lower your voice in my office or leave immediately. Daniel glared, breathing hard, but sat back down. Helen rose slowly from her chair, smoothing one hand over the front of her dress. She had imagined this moment might feel triumphant. Instead it felt like attending a funeral for people still living. You all spent weeks deciding I was no longer fit to control my own life, she said, looking at each of them one by one. So hear me clearly now while there can be no confusion. I am of sound mind. I know exactly what you intended, and I will not spend one more day pretending I did not see who you truly are. Vanessa's polished mask finally cracked. So what now? You just cut off your own children over one misunderstanding? Helen gave her a look so level and unblinking that Vanessa fell silent at once. No, Helen said. I am cutting off people who mistook my kindness for weakness. She turned to Daniel last. For one brief second she saw something in his face that almost resembled the little boy who used to run into her arms after school. Then the greed returned and swallowed it whole. You taught me to value family, he said bitterly. Helen's answer came without hesitation. And you taught me that not everyone who shares your blood deserves your trust. She gathered her purse, nodded once to Martin, and walked toward the door. Behind her the room erupted into voices again. Protest, excuses, anger, panic, but Helen did not turn back. She kept walking through the polished hallway, past the receptionist's desk, out into the crisp afternoon air where sunlight warmed the pavement and traffic moved lazily down Main Street, as if the world had not just split open. For a long moment she stood beside her car and simply breathed. Her hands trembled then. Finally, after holding steady for days, not from fear, not from regret, from the sheer weight of understanding that the people she loved had destroyed something they would never get back. And this time, there would be no second chances. The first week after the confrontation passed in silence so complete it felt unnatural. No calls, no texts, no cheerful drop-ins with grocery bags or rehearsed concern. Helen moved through the quiet of her house with an odd mixture of grief and relief, as if some long grinding noise in the background of her life had finally stopped, and only then did she realize how exhausting it had been. She drank her morning coffee alone at the kitchen table, and watched the sun rise over the backyard without interruption. She trimmed her roses. She attended church. She met old friends for lunch and discovered, To her own surprise, that she laughed more easily now than she had in months. But peace, she learned, was temporary when wounded pride had nowhere else to go. The first letter arrived 9 days later. It was from Daniel, handwritten, folded carefully into the kind of envelope he used for Christmas cards. Helen opened it standing at the mailbox, expecting perhaps an apology. Instead, she found 3 pages of blame. He wrote that she had humiliated him, that she had chosen money over family, that Vanessa had cried for days and Melissa could barely sleep. He accused her of overreacting, of weaponizing her grief, of letting strangers poison her against her own children. Not once in the letter did he apologize for what they had done. Not once did he acknowledge the betrayal itself. Every line focused only on consequences. Helen read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the kitchen drawer beside the screenshots. 2 days later, Melissa appeared on the front porch unannounced, eyes red and voice trembling before Helen had even opened the door fully. "Mom, please," she said. "Can we talk?" Helen stepped outside and closed the door behind her. She did not invite her in. Melissa's face crumpled at that small boundary. "You cannot keep punishing us forever over one terrible mistake." Helen studied her daughter's face and saw not remorse but desperation. "One mistake?" she repeated softly. "You planned for weeks to take my home." Melissa's tears spilled faster. "It was Vanessa's idea mostly. Daniel got carried away. We all got carried away. But none of us thought you would react like this." Helen almost smiled at that. React like what? Like a woman who does not wish to be robbed by her own children? Melissa flinched. "You know that is not fair." "No," Helen said quietly. "What was not fair was sitting at my dining room table eating my food while plotting how to erase me from my own life." Melissa's shoulders stiffened. For a moment the tears vanished and anger replaced them. "You are being dramatic." There it was. The entitlement beneath the apology. The belief that Helen's pain was inconvenient because it interfered with what they wanted. Helen stepped back from the door. "Goodbye, Melissa." Her daughter's face hardened completely. "You are going to die alone in that house if you keep this up." The words hung in the autumn air between them, sharp and ugly. Helen felt the sting of them. Of course she did. Some wounds landed because they came from the hands that once reached for yours in trust. But she had lived through greater pain than cruel words. She had buried the love of her life. She had sat in hospital rooms praying over impossible diagnoses. She had survived the kind of loneliness that changed a person at the bone. Fear no longer moved her the way it once had. Helen met her daughter's furious stare and answered with perfect calm. "Better alone than surrounded by people who wait for me to become useful only in death." Melissa recoiled as if struck. Then she turned and marched down the walkway without another word. Helen watched her drive away before going back inside, locking the door gently behind her. That evening she sat in Thomas's old chair in the study, the sunset casting gold across the walls, and understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They still believed this was temporary. They still believed guilt and pressure and fear would wear her down eventually. They had not yet accepted that the version of their mother who forgave everything no longer existed. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the kind of cold that settled into the bones of old houses and made every room feel quieter after dark. Helen spent the weeks before Christmas decorating alone for the first time in her life. She strung white lights across the staircase, hung the same handmade stockings she had sewn when Daniel and Melissa were children, and placed Thomas's favorite angel on top of the tree with hands steadier than she expected. The house looked beautiful. It also looked like a museum to a life that no longer existed. Though, she refused to let grief turn the season bitter. Instead, she invited the people who had remained kind. Her sister Margaret and her husband came. 2 neighbors from church came with homemade pies. Martin and his wife stopped by with wine and flowers. On Christmas Eve, laughter filled the dining room again. Genuine this time, warm and unforced, and Helen realized halfway through dessert that she had built a table full of peace by simply removing those who brought poison to it. She should have known her children would not let the holiday pass quietly. At 8:30 that night, as the last guests were leaving and snow drifted softly across the porch, headlights swept across the front windows. Daniel's SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by Melissa's sedan. Helen's stomach tightened, but she set down her wineglass calmly and walked to the door before they could pound on it. Daniel stood on the porch with his jaw clenched, Melissa beside him wrapped in a coat she clearly had not buttoned properly in her haste. Neither looked sober enough to be rational. "We saw cars here," Daniel said immediately, peering past Helen into the house. "So you will host strangers for Christmas but not your own family?" Helen kept one hand on the door. "I hosted people who wished me well." Melissa's eyes flashed. "You are seriously still doing this?" Months later, Helen almost admired their certainty that time itself should erase accountability. "Yes," she said. Months later, "Actions do not expire because you are tired of consequences." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mom, enough. You made your point. Reverse the trust changes and stop embarrassing us. This has gone too far." There it was again. Not sorrow, not shame, only outrage that their punishment had outlasted their patience. Helen let the silence stretch between them while snowflakes gathered on the shoulders of Daniel's coat. Then she answered with a calm so complete it seemed to anger him more than shouting ever could. "Do you know what embarrassed me, Daniel? Reading messages from my own son discussing how to convince people I had lost my mind." His expression shifted, just for a second, and she saw the faintest flicker of shame. But then Vanessa's voice carried from inside the SUV where she sat waiting. "Tell her we are done begging." Daniel's face hardened again. "Fine," he snapped. "Enjoy your empty house. Enjoy your fake little replacement family. But when you need help someday, do not call us." Helen's laugh surprised even her. It was soft, brief, and utterly without warmth. "You stopped being helped the moment you started calculating what my death would be worth to you." Melissa gasped as though slapped. Daniel muttered a curse under his breath and turned away. Helen watched them march back to their cars with the stiff fury of people who had not gotten what they believed life owed them. Engines roared. Tires crunched over fresh snow. Then they were gone. Helen stood in the doorway a moment longer, the cold air curling around her ankles, before gently shutting the door and locking it. Inside, the house glowed gold with Christmas lights and lingering warmth from the evening's celebration. She leaned against the door and listened to the silence settle again. But this time it did not feel lonely. It felt earned. She walked back to the living room, where the tree sparkled beside the window and wrapped gifts sat beneath it for people who loved her without agenda. Then Helen lowered herself into her armchair, folded a blanket over her knees, and smiled faintly into the firelight. Her children had spent months trying to convince her she would have nothing without them. Yet somehow, this was the most peaceful Christmas she had known in years. Spring arrived slowly, melting the last traces of snow from the lawn and coaxing the first green buds from the rose bushes Helen had planted with Thomas decades earlier. Life settled into a new rhythm, one quieter than before but steadier, cleaner somehow, as if the house itself could breathe again now that deceit no longer crossed its threshold. Weeks turned into months. Daniel did not call. Melissa did not write. The silence stretched so long that eventually it stopped feeling like punishment and began to feel like peace. Helen filled her days with things she had neglected, while trying to preserve a family that no longer existed. She joined the historical society in town and began volunteering twice a week at the local library, where children gathered around her during story hour and listened as though her voice carried magic. She took painting classes at the community center and discovered, to her surprise, that she was quite good at watercolor landscapes. She traveled with Margaret to Charleston for a long weekend and stood on a sunny balcony overlooking the harbor thinking that perhaps grief and betrayal had not ended her life after all. Perhaps they had simply cleared space for the part of it she had never expected to still have. Then one warm afternoon in May, Martin called and asked if she could stop by his office. Helen found him smiling when she arrived, though there was a note of disbelief in his expression. "You may find this interesting," he said, handing her a newspaper clipping. It was a short business column from the local paper. Greg's company had folded under investigation for financial misconduct. Melissa and Greg were reportedly separating. Vanessa had left Daniel 3 weeks earlier after what one neighbor described online as a messy dispute over money. Helen stared at the article for a long moment, then set it down gently. "Funny," she murmured. Martin lifted a brow. "What is?" Helen gave the faintest smile. "Greed tends to eat its own eventually." That evening, as she watered her roses in the golden hush before sunset, a familiar car rolled slowly to the curb. Daniel stepped out alone. He looked older somehow, thinner. The confidence that once puffed his shoulders high had collapsed into something smaller, more uncertain. Helen remained by the flower bed, garden hose in hand, and watched him approach. He stopped several feet away. "Mom," he said quietly. Helen waited. He swallowed hard. "Vanessa left. Took a lot more than I thought she could." Helen said nothing. He looked down at the grass. "Melissa and Greg are a mess too. Everything kind of fell apart." The pause that followed was heavy with all the words he was not brave enough to say directly. Finally he looked up. "I made mistakes." Helen studied his face. For the first time in many months, she saw not entitlement or anger, but genuine weariness. Whether it was regret for betraying her or regret for how badly his plans had failed, she could not yet know. "Yes," she said. "You did." His eyes glistened. "I do not expect everything to be fixed. I wanted to say I am sorry." Helen turned off the hose. Water dripped softly onto the dark earth around the roses. She considered him for a long moment. This grown man she had once carried on her hip, who had broken something sacred between them for the price of square footage and resale value. Some betrayals could be forgiven. Others could only be remembered honestly. "I believe you are sorry," she said at last. Relief flashed across his face too quickly. Then she added, "But being sorry does not restore trust. It does not undo what you chose when you thought I was vulnerable." His shoulders sagged. "I know." Helen nodded once toward the gate. "Then perhaps one day, if your actions match your apology long enough, we will see what remains worth rebuilding. But understand this clearly, Daniel." Her voice sharpened, quiet and certain. "You will never again mistake my love for permission to betray me." Tears slipped down his face then, and this time Helen did not rush to comfort him. She simply stood among her roses, steady as stone, while the son who nearly lost everything finally understood the cost of greed. When he left, Helen watched him drive away beneath the fading evening light, then returned to her garden and resumed watering the flowers. The house stood behind her warm and golden, untouched, still hers. They had wanted her home so badly they nearly destroyed the only place they ever truly belonged. In the end, they lost far more than a house. They lost the woman who once would have given them everything.